So, hello everyone. I'm really happy. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be here. I was telling some of you and Eric that I was here as a student many years ago at the same summer school. I think that it was taking place in a different room. It wasn't this room, but I really.
The room changed.
But everything else is
room.
definitely. Ken Arrow was then the head of the school, but I really had a great experience. I kept in touch with some of my fellow students, so I'm sure this will be great for you. And I think there's a lot of diversity in this program. I mean, you've seen already great speakers doing some more development perspective. I think what I decided to do is to present 3 projects. I'll talk about a lot about the literature they build on, and these 3 projects are close to my research agenda, which is, so I work a lot on international trade, mostly also trade policy, on political economy and firm organization. My firm organization side for the global supply chain, and I really like it, but I cannot do in 3 hours everything. So I'm going to give you a glimpse on my research agenda on political economy. That's the first paper I present. This is an ongoing project with Michael and Mathieu. I will tell you more about them and the team. And then I'm going to talk to you about, so this is actually going to be related a lot to some of the firm heterogeneity literature that Isabel was hinting, but looking from a point of view of political economy and lobbying. So this is part of my ERC agenda. Then I'm going to talk to you about a project that is published on the ER, which is looking at, starting to look at the other topic I want to tell you about, which is the effects of trade policy on intermediate goods trade and global supply chains in a world with fragmented production. And that's a paper that is very much related to work that Lorenzo Caliendo talked to you about, his paper with Parro, and actually is related also to what Mark will teach in a few days. So I think that paper in between, you'll see connections with both some of the previous lectures and some of what will come. And finally, if I have time, I want to look at a different policy. So this second paper talks about trade agreements and how can they affect the organization of production. And then I want to talk to you about another ongoing project that looks at a different trade policy, a protectionist trade policy, and how that can affect supply chains. Okay, so but I'll start from political economy. So this is a project with Mathieu, who is also a co-author of Isabel. And he's with me at the Caresse, as Isabel actually was hinting. I'm actually moving in a few months. I've been very, very happy at the Caresse for many years, but I'm now moving to Oxford. But anyway, this is a project with Mathieu, who is still at the Caresse with me for a few months, and with Michael, who used to be one of my PhD students at the Caresse, is now in. And it's about lobbying, and in particular, it's about lobbying on trade agreements. And actually, both my first paper and my second paper are motivated by one of the key trends in international trade over the last few decades, which is the surge in the number of regional trade agreements. If you look from the early 90s in particular till today, you have a proliferation in the number of regional trade agreements that have been negotiated. There are more than 350 now in force, and most of them, over 90% of them, are free trade agreements. The minority are customs unions. And when you look at the political economy of these free trade agreements, what Benny Roderick, in a very influential paper on the Journal Economics of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, has argued, is that this idea that it's all about protectionist interest dominating is no longer there. There's basically the very influential protection for sale literature of Grossman-Hellman that has been the workhorse model in political economy of trade. And he says, and then based on that, you would expect a lot of protectionism, lobbying for protection. And what Roderick argues, without really empirical evidence nor a model, is that now, if you look at these trade agreements and who are the key players, they are not protectionist players, but they're all pro-global players who gain from the reduction in trade barriers. And so they are on the export side rather than being on the import competing side. And they tend to be multinational, big pharmaceuticals. These are big companies who push for these trade agreements. So this has been a very provocative argument of Demi. What we are doing in this paper is to actually look at this argument with now actual data and with a model, and we'll actually provide empirical evidence and a theoretical model that will actually support this view that the politics of free trade agreements or trade agreements is dominated by large companies that gain from these agreements. So although this view may seem at odds with the standard Grossman-Hellman protection for sale literature that you are probably familiar with, I would say that this is not actually, this contrast is only apparent because if you look at that literature, it's focused on a different kind of trade policy. That's focused on a unilateral protectionist measure. Should I protect an industry? It's industry specific and it's unilateral. So from that point of view, if you're looking at firms in one country and you're asking them, would you like to be protected? Everyone will say yes and will gain from protection. There's nothing to gain unless you're maybe sourcing inputs in that industry from liberalization. Trade agreements are a different kind of trade policy because they are bilateral or even multilateral. So they are, but there's multiple countries and there are reciprocal element to it. So suppose you're looking at the agreement US-Korea, the US is eliminating its tariff vis-a-vis Korea, but Korea is doing the same across all sectors. So there's a reciprocal dimension. So you're gaining market access, better access in another market, your FTA partner, for your final good. But there's also a second difference. They're not sector specific. Under Article 24 of the GATT WTO, if the US negotiates a free trade agreement, that is to eliminate all barriers across the board. So you are going to not only get better access for your final goods in the foreign market, but also the US has to eliminate all tariffs, which means you also will have access to cheaper inputs. So you have an alternative channel through which you can gain as a firm. So although you would expect maybe opposition, strong protectionist pressure in the case of unilateral sector-specific policies, in the case of trade agreements, is not actually surprising, particularly once you start thinking about heterogeneous firms, that the largest firms who are exporting and importing will actually gain from such trade policy. So precisely because of what I just said. So what we do in this paper, yes.
So if you look at bilateral firm that wants to export to other countries, again, but is it the case that firm is going to be imported from the other country?
It depends. So you're going to have three effects in principle. So if the US eliminates all tariffs and the FTA partner eliminates all the tariffs, well, you're going to have three effects. On one hand, there is the increase in import competition in your own sector. Suppose you're making, cars. Now with the trade agreement with Korea, you eliminate the tariff on car, and now your GM, you're going to suffer. You can increase in import competition from the Korean car producers. On the other hand, Korea eliminates the tariff vis-a-vis you on cars, so you can expand in terms of your, you can reach a better access to the Korean consumers of your cars, and on top of it, you have cheaper steel, all the inputs that you need. If you're sourcing from Korea, you can get access to cheaper inputs.
Well, that's what I was asking.
Yeah. So it depends on whether you're sourcing.
It's very likely that the US is going to be importing steel from Korea, or more generally, how often does your export partner also provide imports?
I think what I'll show you is that actually the lobbying and how much firms spend lobbying for these trade agreements depends both on how much they can gain in terms of access for the final goods in the foreign market, but also access to foreign supply. So we're going to measure that and show you that indeed political support for this agreement depends on the extent to which these channels are afforded.
Question?
Yeah.
The constraint that it should be cover all sectors. It's self-imposed. It's an empirical observation.
It's imposed by the WTO, because the WTO.
Two countries cannot make an agreement that covers only two sectors.
No, Article 1 of the WTO, the GATT WTO says no discrimination. That's the MFN principle. So we have to treat each other the same way. There are two main exceptions to this article. One is Article 24 of the GATT, which allows preferential trade agreements, but then if you are entering a preferential trade agreement, you have to eliminate all tariffs. You cannot pick and choose. There is some, so this is the multilateral trade rules.
What's enforcement mechanism? Why do countries abide by those rules?
That's a good question.
Why would there be two countries and two sectors that decide to make two-sector, two-country agreement outside of all this
Because
framework.
otherwise you would undo altogether the multilateral trading system. So if you look, there is empirical work by various teams looking at whether, for example, the EU and the US in the free trade agreements do eliminate all tariffs across all products. And there's evidence that in the US, I think it's less than 1% of HS6 products that are not liberalized. It may take time, it may take a period. Most of them are liberalized immediately after they enter into force. Then some go, there may be a phase out period, but by 10 years, everything is removed. This is for developed member countries. There's some flexibility granted to developing member countries when negotiating preferential trade agreements. They don't need to eliminate everything. But if you're looking at the US, which is the country we're going to looking at here, there's a very strict rule that says in your FTAs, you're supposed to eliminate all tariffs. If you're going to have a preferential agreement that is an exception to the multilateral rule of no discrimination, you have to do it in a certain way. And the US does do it because if you look at all the trade agreements, they apply the Article 24 rule. I could talk much more. There's other exceptions like GSP, but let's not do that. So what we do in this paper is first of all providing, using very detailed information available under the Lobbying Disclosure Act of the United States, which is why we focus on the US. We are going to look at very detailed data on lobby and construct a data set that allows us to see for each trade agreement the US has negotiated since the passage of this Lobbying Disclosure Act in '95. We can look at, the firms that lobbied, which ones lobbied, how much they spent. We can then look at what characteristics are they importing, are they, multinational. And so we construct this new data set on firm level lobbying on US free trade agreements. With this data set, we then can uncover new facts that some of them may not be, I'll let you decide how surprising they are. Some echoes previous work, but some are really novel because this data was not available before. And in particular, some of the results on the extensive margin will very much echo Roderick's view. So I'll show you that the firms that lobbying on trade agreements are the happy few, basically, what you were calling the happy few, the superstar. There are few, lobbying on trade agreements is a rare event and is dominated by large companies, mostly multinationals or importer-exporters. They gain from trade agreement and in over 98%, 99 even, lobbying in favor of this agreement. There's basically no opposition among the lobbies. So there's clear selection into lobbying on trade agreements by firms that select into trade and gain from this agreement. And I'm going to show you also that, results on the intensive margin, focusing on those firms that do lobby, what explains the variation in the lobbying expense, how much effort they put lobbying for these agreements to be passed. And then, since the existing literature, which I'm going to mention in a second, does not have heterogeneous firm and endogenous lobbying, selection into lobbying, we are going to build a model, which is going to be a simple model. We have actually a very stripped down now version, and many appendices that extended along various dimensions. But it's going to be a simple model, what I'm going to show you, of selection into trade on one hand and selection into lobbying. And they're going to move very much in the same direction. Okay, so in terms of the literature, we are building on the literature on political economy of trade more generally, but in particular the literature on political economy of free trade agreements. So this is the Grossman-Helfman ER free trade agreements, politics of free trade agreements. That is building very much on the '94 paper, which was the protection for sale paper. Again, so you're looking at lobbying by industries, not firms. There's no firms. It's sectors they lobby. And this is also true, by the way, of this might be not a very recent paper, which is RMR now at ATR. So even very recent papers don't look at the perspective of firms. They look at the perspective of sectors. But when you look at the data, I'll show you that industry association and sectors are really not the key players. It's individual firms that dominate lobbying. So what we want to do, so you have a few papers. These are 2 QJE papers that have firms that, again, homogeneous firms. So if you want the old literature or even some of the recent papers have taken a perspective that is sectoral. And so you miss out on the firm heterogeneity within sectors. Think about textiles. You would have more producers and you have 9. So thinking about sector lobby makes no sense because the distributional effect of a trade agreement will be very different for small or large producers within it. So the key contribution to this literature is to bring in firm heterogeneity. of course, then we are building on the whole list of parameters and API trade that I think Isabella spoke to you a lot about. I mean, which has shown us that there are all these different margins of selection into trade. There's exporting, many papers showing that. There is, of course, selection into FDI. Think about the Hellman-Melitz AR paper. And there is a more recent work showing selection into import. It's only the most productive firms that are sourcing into from globally from foreign supply. So we know that on all these margins, not all firms engage in trade. It's only the largest, most productive. And this is going to be a key feature of our model and also what comes out really from our data. And finally, in terms of the political structure of our model, we are actually departing from the protection for sale model, which is building on Burnham and Winston is a menu auction model. I mean, it is very nice and it's very nice micro foundation, but we're going to use actually a contest model, which in somewhat is more reduced form and black boxy, but I think has very appealing features for our purposes and allows you to really model lobbying under uncertainty, which I think makes a lot of sense given the kind of lobbying we are having. So I'm gonna, go into these literature, when I discuss the model. So I think a lot of the work I'm doing with this project and other projects, actually, many of you are at MIT. I'm working a lot, and I'll say maybe at the end something with In-Sung Kim, who is a political scientist who used to be at Princeton and is in the political science department at MIT, and he's also working with lobbying data, and he has created this lobby view dataset. We are not using his dataset in this project, but we are working on another paper with him, and it's amazing what you can do. If you're interested in political economy now, and if you are at MIT, you should definitely be something. It's going to be a scan for next year, but it's just been tenure at MIT, so it's going to be around. So what they all work on political economy and lobbying in particular. So if you think about the first testing of Grossman and Hellman, the ADR 99 Golden Magic, for example, or also Matilde Bombardini's market paper on the AI, they were all using campaign contribution data to study, to test models, political economy models of lobbying. The problem with this data is that you're sort of seeing, say, a corporation giving money to a senator. Say you're a senator, I observe some corporation or association giving money to you, but I don't know whether I'm trying to influence your trade policy or maybe immigration policy or antitrust. So the two limitations really of these old data, the main one I would say that you're not able to observe the policy that's being targeted, which is instead what you can do very well, as I'll show you, with the new data that's been used in recent studies and we use for our projects, which is data on lobbying expenditures. This is basically thanks to this Lobbying Disclosure Act that was passed in '95. Everyone who lobbies, firms, associations, unions, have to report. Up to 2008 was every semester, and as of 2008 is every quarter, everything you spend lobbying. And lobbying is defined, as I'll tell you later, in a very broad terms. It's basically any activity that is to influence federal policy making. It could be meetings, it could be, you organize a workshop to say upgrade these policies, it could be also, as long as it's not bribes. And no campaign contributions, because these have to be recorded separately. I'll tell you more about what these lobbying expenditures are, but you have to report everything. If it is less than 5,000, you have to say it's less than 5,000. As of 5,000, you have to report exactly how much money you spend lobbying. You could have hired a lobbyist, you may have an in-house lobbyist who's spending time for you trying to influence. You have to say not only the amount per term or per semester or quarter, but also, more importantly, which issues. Broad issues, say competition, trade, migration, there are 79 of them. And then within a broad issue, you have to say specific issues. So that's where you will see, I'm lobbying on trade, and then on the specific issue, free trade agreement with Panama, with Korea, with Colombia. So, or anti-dumping, you can look at specific trade policies that are being lobbied by firms. So it's really that you can look at the issues targeted. So this is really the main advantage compared to data on campaign contribution. But the other advantage, if you look at most of the money spent in the US, what I put here is not by issue, but just total, in these congresses from 97 to the amount of money spent, accounted by lobbying expenditures on all issues, and the amount of money that is going to campaign contribution is like, I think, more than 10 times lobbying expenditure. So it's the key channel to which lobbying actually operates. So this is the kind of data from lobbying report, LBA lobbying report, that we're going to use to study, in this case, in this project, lobbying on free trade agreements. But you are in, suppose you're interested in antitrust or another policy immigration, you can look at, you can use this data, it's extremely rich, to look at other policies that that can be influenced and are influenced, shaped by political pressures. Yes, please.
I don't know how much you want to game of lobbying, but wouldn't I want to talk with the candidate in terms of people who are campaigning on this?
Sure. This is the quid pro quo kind of lobbying that has been very much documented. I mean, there's.
Wouldn't that come into the campaign?
So yeah, this is the campaign, the blue card.
No, I'm wondering why the campaign is so low.
Because the other one is very high.
What?
Because basically, the other one is like these large companies, a lot of companies that have in-house lobbying departments that are really large. You employ people who are there to go and meet, you have, I can tell you much more, maybe also in the break, but this lobbying goes to either in-house, you are basically, these lobbying expenditure are not just for the campaign, they're any activity, including really employing people who are full-time lobbyists or hiring independent lobbying agents in case Street in Washington to do this advocacy in particular committees, in particular. So it's all the work around it, which is not campaign contribution, but is basically a lot of the money spent trying to influence policies. I mean, you can basically look that the PAC contributions are there, but they are small compared to lobbying expenditure. I see lots of head space. Yes, Eric.
I assume that it's the firms themselves that will report any lobbying and that purpose.
It depends. There are two ways. If you, I'll show you when we look at lobby reports. So if you are doing the lobbying using in-house lobbyists, you are the one who has to file the report. If you're using a lobbying agency, the lobbying agency is the registrant and has to say that you are the client. And so you get the information anyway. We're going to use all both direct and indirect lobbying. In the case of our lobbying on trade agreements, I think over 70% of the lobbying is done in-house.
But I'm wondering, what is the incentive for this?
Are there penalties? I mean, there are papers showing, I mean, that, again, you may have, and maybe this is working against some, not full, but they do, they are legal and civil, there is penalties if you don't fully report those expenses. And you do see firms even reporting, you can tick less than 5,000 and you tick, and you see firms never leaving empty. So when they have broad issues, they always feel. So I think they do it now at the beginning, you may have had maybe more concerns in the early years, but now it's like a machine. Every quarter, every firm reports, and I think you're supposed to report, truthfully, and there are penalties if you don't. I think Matilde Bombardini, Marianne, I think if you look at some of the work that I was citing here, this is more about revolving door lobbying, but the Bertrand et al., this is for Bombardini, Credi, and Marianne Bertrand. They also use this data, and a lot of these studies now rely on the fact that there's, if not truthful, this is you're expected in their penalties, if you don't report correctly all your lobbying expenses. What you don't have, I don't know. I will look and get back to you on this. I don't know. I think there are ways around if you give, and that they have another paper where you could not report if you're giving gifts you're not supposed to do, that's unlawful. But if you're like through an NGO, you may give donations. So there are ways to avoid taxes. But most of the expenses are supposed to be recorded, and I think I should look at the literature more, because we need to see if people have looked at penalties and firms that have been caught in. So anyway, what is great is that you do have, which is not something that you have with the tax data, and it's not something you have in any other country. Because in Europe, for example, there's a lot of lobbying. I live in Brussels, and there's lobbies everywhere, but you don't know what these firms are doing. Clearly, there's now a record of meeting with commissioners at DG. You can see sometimes by DG, but it's nothing compared to this. Partly it's because money is not allowed. Campaign contributions are just simply lawful in Europe, but this kind of lobbying expenditure would be allowed in Europe because this is informational lobbying. It's not, you're not paying a campaign of a politician, which would be illegal in Europe. It's not in the US, but you don't have any data like this, which instead you can really track. Maybe there's some underreporting, but in any case, there's a lot of variation and a lot of details as you see. So let me move on to, so you're supposed to report, there's significant penalties for violations and look into whether violations have actually been, on enforcement issues. But what is also clear is that the way the LGA described lobbying is very, very broad. And maybe let me give you that just this is, I was for fun looking at if I wanted to hire a lobbyist, and you go online and you say, okay, how much, this is if you want to hire, you don't have your own in-house lobbyist, you can say, okay, these are your various fees, it could be you are formulating an issue paper, you meet with the congressionals, this is like basic treatments. But then if you want to go into more specific, we can, you can pay more, and we do a construct an advocacy website, have website, annual day on the Hill. So you can see, obviously, district visit by lawmaker, they do a lot of stuff for you. This is not campaign contribution, but it's many things that can help facilitate, you put in your particular, provisions in a bill, etc. So this is
Yeah. How much is this?
This is
$95 per what?
per month.
Oh, quite cheap.
This is quite cheap, yeah. But that's yeah. Okay, so actually I didn't take a question. There was a question from, there were two questions. So go ahead.
Can you talk a little bit about the mechanisms for resolving? And is it like just persuasion, or what's happening behind the scenes that make lobbying effective?
So I'm not going to say very much. I think this is again, so the model is going to be a model in which we are going to take, you're going to have a contest model where you're trying to push your view. There may be a bias, but so the problem with this data, you know a lot, and I give you detailed information on what we know, but we don't know, is it through meetings with politicians? Is it because you are, so it's informational lobbying broadly defined, but the exact mechanism, you would want to know even more information to really get at that. Yes.
So I guess related to that, should we think about lobbying like the Grossman-Helpman way, as sort of distorting whatever the previous or prior equilibrium was, and in a way, so when you think this is not protection per se, but sort of the reverse, do we think of the outcome of this as having too much betray?
So I'm not going to take, this is going to be a political economy paper that is a positive. I'm going to show you, politics on this, free trade agreement, which is one of the main trade policies, dominated by these large firms. Whether it's good or bad, we can have a discussion at the end, and with Mathieu, we are thinking, it depends. We are not going to take a stance, like, it's not like Osa and Maggi. They have a particular model where they can take a stance about whether the industry lobbying is good or bad. It's only a theoretical paper, there's no empirics on particular kind of regulations. Here, I'm not gonna, we can go back to the welfare, the more normative, questions at the end, but this is a positive paper. Even on in the model, we are not gonna make welfare statements. Okay, yes.
The incentives of the lobbies. I mean, here they don't care. I mean, other lobbying agreements of the sort. If this law passes, you get paid. Otherwise, you don't. Like with lawyers, where they get paid only on success.
No, most of the, as I said earlier, most of the lobbies, at least in our data, are people employed by the lobbies themselves. So you have, your Apple, you have your own lobbying department. So you don't have a concern that you may not be paid if you don't do the job. You're paid sometimes by the hour, sometimes you have, but there's this concern that you seem to have about it. You may not get paid. I don't think that's an issue that
No,
they are there.
about the incentive of the lobbies.
Okay.
Okay,
We are not going to look, we're going to use basically more. You could look and there's a lot of information on who the lobbyists are. This is not a paper about from the lobbyist perspective, it's more from the firm's perspective. So what we do is to focus in this project on lobbying on free trade agreements. And to that purpose, what we do as our main way to identify lobbying activities related to trade agreements is to look for all lobbying reports that mention the bill numbers that are corresponding for the ratification of trade agreements. So if you say, okay, we're talking about Korea entered into force in what was it, 2012, and then it was voted in 2011, and these were the House resolution and Senate resolution bills. So so what we are going to focus in our main analysis, in our main data set, is lobbying or ratification, which happens basically after the president signs an agreement, then the bill, it has to be ratified by Congress, and by the way, the other trading partners, say Korea, is also to ratify for the agreement to enter into force. And then, so basically, it's when the bill is already, the agreement is written, is signed, there's nothing you can do, you cannot change it under fast track authority, which all these agreements have been negotiated. There's no way you can amend. The only decision politicians have to make is whether to ratify or not. And the only thing that firms can do at this stage is push in favor or against ratification, because the agreement has been signed, there's nothing you can change. And that's actually, it's a good reason, one of the good reasons to focus as the main analysis on lobbying or ratification, because if you're looking at lobbying before, during the negotiation, you could actually shape the content, and you want a different model. And this is something we are doing now in another project, in fact, with Song Kim and others, we are looking at lobbying in the content of trade agreements during the negotiation, where you can actually look at which IPR provisions, investment provision you may want to put in. Here we are looking from the point of view of an agreement that has been signed, and now that you're at the ratification stage, do you want this agreement to pass over? Before and after? Yeah, we are doing that in the, I think a lot of the actually money spent, I have a picture of that at the end, actually. Okay. So let me show you, first of all, that why I think the literature has missed out a lot of the action, because the literature has been talking about industry-associated industry lobbying. But if you look at most of the lobbying expenditure, I'm going to show you later how we come up with this number, but it's individual firms and lobbies, not the association. So, and again, it makes sense given that that within industries you have heterogeneous preferences depending on whether firms are large, small, whether they participate in trade along the various markets. So what we get from the reports, as you'll see, I give you several examples, is the identity of the firm lobbying, either as a registrant or as a client of a lobby firm, as you see, and you can basically retrieve information on the amount of money spent every quarter on a particular trade agreement. That's what our data set will end up giving us. And what more importantly, we can also code the position of the firm on the trade agreement. So this is what's nice about trade agreements, is that you can really see, they say, I lobbying in favor, I support. You can do text analysis on, on the actually lobbying reports, and I'll show you, how rich this is, and you can actually see that the firms themselves tell you their position. In a few cases, the position is not.
Since it says passage of the entirety, this it may pass also not in its entirety.
No, it's not possible. It's not possible. I can tell you this.
Okay.
It's not possible to amend because in the US.
No, but here
okay, this is let me give you some example, but it's basically not possible to not accepted in its entirety. So this was a firm maybe not knowing the law. This is an example of stating.
Okay.
Let me give you also, in a few cases, we don't have from the text of the lobbying reports the position of the firm. In those cases where the lobbying reports themselves doesn't give you the position, we rely on official company statements. These are a couple of examples. So, you know, when Korea passed applied materials, you know, we have a report saying in that, you know, in one quarter in 2011, you know, it says I'm spending 250,000 lobbying on this agreement, but we don't have anything that says in support. At the same time, around the time of the ratification, the CEO of this company said, we welcome finally, you know, you can see, I put in italics, or the words finally approved will help us, the passage and implementation is the most significant. So we use sometimes official company statements when we don't have information from the reports. But let me give you information from the reports and give you, you know, how rich. So you can see also for your future project, if you want to use this kind of data, how rich it is. So this is an example of a report filed post 2008, and these are digitalized. If you have to work with earlier reports, they are not digitalized, but then now there's, you know, with the team at the MIT, they've hired a lot of computer scientists, so now you can go much faster. But, you know, a lot of it is manual. But anyway, this is one that is digitalized, and let me give you, this is Philip Morris International. So this is Philip Morris as a company that is lobbying. So you get the name of the lobbyist, you get the address. Notice that here it says client name self. This is when you're yourself with your in-house lobbying department doing the lobbying. If instead Philip Morris had hired a lobbying company, a lobbying agency, then the lobbying agency will be the registrant and the client will be Philip Morris. So we have both cases in our data. This is when is it filed? It's reported in 2008 in the fourth quarter. And so if you're lobbying directly, then this is reported as an expense. If you're lobbying, if the registrant is the lobbying agency, this is reported as income. So here is the amount that Philip Morris is spending on the fourth quarter of 2008. It's a bit more than 1 million. And then when you go to the section 15 of the lobbying report, the general issue is in section 15 and TRD is straight. And the specific lobbying issue is HR 5728, so these House resolution, these Senate resolution, which are corresponding to the ratification of the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And here is the entire issue of the bill. So the enactment of the entire bill, but you cannot do it otherwise. I cannot show you a paper on fast track authority that will, but you know, it says basically to implement this. Let me give you a few others. I think it's really rich because I think this is fascinating. So, you know, this is an old one, blurry. And when pre-2008, they were every 6 months. So this is a report filed in the second semester of 2005. This is Miller, their company. And you have the address. It's again lobbying in-house. And the amount of money is more or less 375,000. And again, TRT. And this is support for, basically, this is the US Dominican Republic, Central American Free Trade Agreement. So you get the point that we have many more examples, but let me not go there.
Are there many examples holding trade agreement?
No, that's what I'm going to get to in the stylized text. It's basically no. There's actually 2 firms ever that are ever found lobbying against ratification. And even if you look at the different methodology with keywords, there's basically, and these 2 firms, by the way, they lobbied against one trade agreement, US-Colombia, I think, but they lobbied in favor of others. So if you were to look at a firm that always opposes, that's one of the striking, actually, findings of.
Ask a question?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm thinking about the motivation for the firms as an individual firm to pay that such a huge amount of money. So why does this the single firm want to do that instead of like a union stuff? Because like the large firms pay a lot and there may be a lot of free riders, right? like the small
So
firms.
we're going to discuss exactly the incentive of firms to lobby and free riding when we get to the models. If you don't mind
Yeah, sure.
waiting until then, that's going to be that's what I want to get precisely after we document the findings, and then you'll see what are the incentive of individual firms both to select into lobbying, so whether to participate and how much to spend on each free trade agreement. And you'll see that there is free riding by the smaller firms indeed, who may benefit from an agreement, but they don't actually pay, they rely on the largest firms putting the effort. Okay, so this is the kind of, based on this lobby report, we can construct a lot of variables capturing lobbying, both at the extensive margin at the firm agreement level. So we can see firm F, say Apple, is lobbying on agreement A, say US, Korea in a particular year. You can also see not just whether or not it's lobbying, but how much effort is putting on each particular agreement in terms of both the amount of money. And since this amount of money is measured with error, because sometimes you have a total amount spent in a quarter, but then you may say have 3 issues you're lobbying on, and then you have to divide equally. So we also need to measure the intensive margin with just number of reports that mention the issue, which is maybe less interesting but suffers less conversion. And then what we did is match our data set from level lobby data set with Compustat to get a lot of information about these lobbying firms and also be able to compare them with firms that do not lobby. So we know their size in terms of sales and employment. We know, and here is about the selection, Compustat is not great for, it's definitely not the kind of data Isabel was using or the kind of data, administrative data I'm using for other projects, but with Compustat you can still get at least some dummies about whether a firm is an exporter, an importer, and a multinational, or any of them. That's going to be the internationalized generally dimension. So you know whether these firms are domestic or whether they engage in some multinational. And also we know which sector they are operating. So we always want to control at the 4-digit what is your sector? Are you a textile? Are you a car maker? And now that's going to matter a lot also in terms of the effects of the trade agreement. So going a bit back to Eric's question. So if we look at a particular agreement A, we want to measure the expected effects, we are going to look at a firm which operates in a sector J, that makes 4 digits. And then we are going to look at what would this agreement do. So since the agreement has to eliminate all tariffs, there are going to be 3 tariffs that are relevant for firms in firms operating in J. Say you're a car maker, the one tariff that you want to look at is the tariff that the Korean is applying on your final goods J. This is going to be the MFN tariff. So the tariff that Korea applies to all WTO members, that is going to be removed if the agreement enters into force. And what's nice is that this you can really take as exogenous from the point of view of firms lobbying in our data set, because these tariffs are the ones negotiated multilateral WTO many years ago in the Uruguay round agreements. These are, not, I've used this argument before. I see you nodding in another paper. I mean, MFN tariffs, not so much anti-dumping and other tariffs, but these MFN tariffs are really given. They are the result of an 8-year negotiation that finished before our data set started. So these are tariffs that are there. So Korea has a particular tariff on cars that is going to be removed if the agreement enters into force. US has a tariff on cars that is going to be removed, not with everyone, but just with the trading partner if the agreement enters into force. And then we also construct this measure, which is the reduction in tariffs on your input. So if your sector J, say cars, you're going to use different inputs. Plastic, you'll have computer chips, you'll have steel, you'll have all sorts of inputs. What do? We use input output tables from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. For each J, we look at the inputs necessary to make this J, and we look at all the tariffs on the input. So this is going to be by how much the agreement is going to eliminate tariffs on your input. Okay, and then obviously, so there's going to be a lot of variation. There are some tariffs that are eliminated of soy. I was looking, soybean producers in the US went from a tariff of 380%, I think, in Korea to 0 the day the agreement went into force. So there's, in some cases, there's enormous variation. In some cases, there's a reduction is not so large. So There's variation both in tariffs, but of course there's also variation in the size of the trading partner, which matters. If you're looking at Panama or Korea, these are very different countries in terms of their market size. So we're going to measure the size of the trading partner with GDP or through, trade data, looking at how much they account for imports and exports to the US. And then we can interact the tariffs with the size of the partner to get an overall effect of the agreement on firms operating in sector trade. So there are going to be these three effects: improved access to foreign consumer. That's going to be bigger. The bigger was the initial tariff that is going to be removed on your final good. And the bigger is the trading partners market. There's also going to be an increased competition in the same sector. So you're going to suffer increased competition in your final good because the US is eliminating the tariff on the final good, and then you're going to have improved access to foreign suppliers for your intermediaries. Finally, I'm almost done with the data. Then we're going to get to the facts. There is we want to measure what expected political support, and you'll see why later, for the ratification of various FTAs. So what we do first is to say, okay, expected political support and how it varies across FTAs. And we have two measures. One is about exploiting differences across Congresses over time in the alignment between the legislative body, Congress, and the executive body, the presidents, in terms of party affiliation. So there is previous work showing that if Congress is from the same party, the majority of Congress is from the same party as the president, you're more likely to pass any bill that the president puts forward. If you're instead from another party, you're going to try to oppose anything, a trade agreement or anything else. So the first measure of political opposition to a free trade agreement is going to be divided government, which is going to be a dummy equal to one if one or both, we have two versions of the houses, are controlled by a party different from the president. The second one is using information on the share of Democrats that are in Congress, in the two houses. This is because during this sample period, no longer today, but definitely in our sample period, Democrats were significantly more likely to vote against trade liberalization. So there's a lot of work. Doug Irwin at Dartmouth have done a lot of work on this, but just for the sake, since I also like data like Isabel, and I found this project, so this is very small, but this is a project I work with other co-authors where we have from the 70s till mid-2000s voting in the US Congress on trade reforms. So what we were interested in there was actually not party affiliation. We were controlling for party affiliation, but we wanted to know if election proximity matters for support for trade liberalization. And what we exploited there was the fact that in the US, you have these two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives, if you are elected there, you have 2-year terms. So you're every 2 years up for re-election. If you're a senator, you have 6-year terms. So much longer, but 1/3 of senators face re-election every 2 years. So what you see here, that's just for you to know, I mean, that if you look at, and this is super robust, so the omitted category is the House. House members are much more protected than the senators, but not so. This is Senate 3. These are the last generation of senators, those who are up, who are closest, who have the same re-election date as House members, the same November election. They are not more, they are as protectionist once you put a bit of controls and fixed effects. There's no distinguishable difference between senators in the last 2 years and House members, but senators who are earlier in their mandate, they are much more protected. So we were showing in this paper the re-election electoral incentive really matters, and the effects are even there if you put individual senator effects. So the same senator will become more protectionist at the end of the term. But that was the point of this paper. But if you see the party dummy in line with all the work done by Hiscox and others, I mean, it's really, this is like implies, since the predicted probability is here, you take this coefficient, that Democrats were 40% less likely to vote in favor of trade agreement. So going back, so this is something, that, the predicted probability of that a legislator votes in favor is decreased by 40% if he or she is a Democrat. So if you're a lobbyist and you know that there's a bigger share of Democrats in a sample period, this is going to be your expectation of political support is like, there's going to be more opposition. So we are going to use, and again, it's exogenous from the point of view of the lobbying firm, arguably, because they cannot affect composition in Congress or whether, there's alignment or not. So now, finally, we can go to the facts. And this is the first fact. I'm going to put it like this pie chart. It's basically all blue with these two firms that are in this text side that lobbied against one agreement. Basically, in 90, this is at the firm agreement level. Using all the information from lobby reports and statements, you see that all the firms that lobbied on trade agreement in our sample, in 99.25% of the cases, lobbied in favor. There's hardly any opposition. You could argue, and we did worry a lot about things,
What percentage was ratified? What percentage passed?
One of the agreements didn't pass Colombia the first time. Then years later, there was a second Colombia agreement that
So all of them just one passed.
all of them, but this one passed with different support, but they all passed. The point is, of course, you don't know whether they passed thanks to all this lobbying, but they all passed. Okay, so then one of the concerns we had is that when we focus on lobbying based on information ratification bills, we are looking at agreements that went all the way to the ratification stage. And so we don't get, for example, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Agreement, which was a major agreement, lots of money was spent on that. But because Trump was elected, it was signed by Obama, but then Trump was elected and he just scrapped it on his first day of office.
Is there
So
a difference in the timing then? That some are ratified soon or some have to wait for 6 years maybe? For the
no, I
next
think you
Congress?
cannot wait 6 years.
So there is a time limit?
There's a time limit, yeah. So let me say, although we did an alternative methodology, which is instead of using ratification bill numbers, we use keywords. And so there you can get TPP, because TPP, you don't have a bill, you never will reach Congress, but you can say TPP, Trans-Pacific, you still get this over 98.4. So it's not because you reach ratification. We can also do Korea. This is the money spent on the Chorus agreement over the negotiation and at the end in the ratification. And again, when you get to the total spending and whether it's in favor or against, it's the overwhelming majority of this lobbying effort is in favor. So let me go to this. No, I'm not doing the right thing. Okay. So what is so the first striking fact, I think very surprising, where people were thinking protection for sale, we think there will be a lot of protection. There will be a lot of opposition, we find now. And by the way, here we were not using Compass again. We are using a lobbying data set. Then the other facts I'm going to document to you are relying on Compass because we are relying on getting additional information about this firm. So this is now telling you that the second fact, unfortunately here you cannot see much, but it's telling you larger firms are more likely to lobby, and you can see you don't even need to run a regression. You can see using now Compass that the distribution of sales or employment is shifted to the right for lobbying firms compared to non-lobbying firms. So when you have Compass, and already it's a sample skewed towards larger firms because these are, publicly listed firms. But even within Compass, that you see that it's only the largest U.S. listed firms that are actually lobbying on trade.
Lobbying firms means in-house lobbying?
No, this is any lobbying in-house or not.
So what's non-lobbying? So I don't understand that.
Whether you're not lobbying, and let me show you the regression. So the dependent variable is, are you lobbying? This is just the extensive matter. Are you lobbying on agreement A? So we have for each agreement, we have a probability of lobbying on that agreement. So we're controlling for agreement fixed effects, sector fixed effects, and the largest firms are more like these are correlations. I'm not pushing causality here, but it's clearly there. Yes.
On the issue of lots of lobbying for a bill, and not so much in opposition. Perhaps there's a selection effect going on there, that you don't even get a bill unless there's going to be a lot of firms who benefit, or some big firms who benefit from it. If the big firms are,
So then that
are
can be.
opposed, perhaps the bill doesn't get formulated in the first place.
So there wouldn't be even a start of a negotiation. No, for example, there's no discussion of a negotiation with China because I think that for many reasons, including the fact that probably, maybe, the largest firm wouldn't want one. So indeed, there's always going to be the fact that some of the trade agreements, there's a, what I showed you there, even when you look at those that start to be negotiated, even during the negotiation, it's not just at the ratification stage, but of course, not every country in the world starts negotiating with the US.
You didn't tell us how much is spent before the bill is
Because
formulated and how much is spent after.
I have it in the other paper. I can tell you most of them.
Okay.
No, I don't know. I want to be precise. Let me send you an email with the precise amount, because we are, again, that's something we are working on, this parallel project, and there's much more work you need to do to get the. Here I was just giving you the position. Even if you look at all the reports in terms of the position of the firms, even before is in favor. In terms of how much money spent, I don't think I have the correct number to give you right now. Okay, let me. Yeah. There's no way I'm going to present the three projects.
Okay,
Go ahead.
you can
No.
cite it.
No. That's fine. It's fine. I think I prefer to slow down and do that. No.
I'm struck by the fact that there's a shop where Israel is a very small country. But in Israel, we have strong lobbying on certain sectors.
Mhm.
For instance, there's the agricultural sector.
Mhm.
And it lobbies in a very aggressive way against trade agreements in the sense of keeping tariffs on food products.
Within trade agreements or in anti-dumping countries? No, that's the key difference. Because there are many protectionist
We don't
measures.
have such sectors in the USA.
No, it's not about sector, it's about what kind of trade policy. The third paper, which I'll probably won't present, is lobbying on policies, trade policies like anti-dumping, where you can really go and say, I want protection, unilateral sector-specific protection against this trading partner on this product. So it's not a trade agreement, it's a very different kind of trade policy. The distributional effects are very different, the politics is very different. So I'm not arguing there's no protection, lobbying for protection in general. I'm saying for trade agreements, which have particular distributional effects, most of the firms, which are the ones who matter in their lobbying, they're lobbying in favor because they have something to gain. But if you're looking at, if they were offered the possibility, do we want to, which there are such measures, anti-dumping, countervailing, safeguards, these are other trade policies. They're very different. There you will see, and you do see, firms that lobby on a specific measure, a lot of the times in favor of protection, often also against. If you think about, I can start talking forever, anti-dumping on sugar, I have a case where I see the sugar company in the US lobbying in favor of this protectionist measure, and I see Mars lobbying against, because this is a downstream producer who doesn't like this. So they're even there, if you look at other trade policies, they may be lobbying in favor of against. But when it comes to trade agreements, these are specific kinds of trade policy. Where Israel, US as a trade agreement, Israel eliminates, the US eliminates. So there is an increase in competition, but there's better market access, both in terms of final consumers and suppliers. And that's a key difference compared to other trade policies. So I'm not saying there's no lobbying for protection. I'm saying this is a paper on lobbying about trade agreements, and that you should keep in mind. Okay, second fact, so this is, the larger firms are more likely to lobby. If you look at the probability regression of the linear probability, the predicted probability of lobbying is very low. It's a rare event that you lobby. But if you increase by 1% firm size, you increase by 1% the probability of lobbying. And then if you look at the other stylized effect on the extensive margin, which, what are the characteristics of firms they select into lobbying, again, you see what broadly has been argued without data or model, but what gets argued is the largest firm that lobby, we saw that, but it's also the firms that are engage in trade. It says on the export side, there are exporters, importers, multinationals, or any of them. And again, if you do look at the probability in terms of you can look at the probit model and see by how much these dummies increase the predicted probability, and the effects is really sizable. Being an importer or exporter, for example, increases the probability of lobbying on FTA by 125%. So again, what you see up to now is correlations, I would argue. I'm not going to argue causality. This is just correlation. Larger firm and firms that are internationalized are more likely to lobby. And these spikes on the extensive margin on selection into lobbying on trade agreements echo the arguments of Danny Roderick. And we also saw, and that is something he was arguing, that they are pushing for these agreements to be implemented. We saw that with our direction of lobbying, effect one. Now I'm going to show you two facts on the intensive margin. So focusing on firms that are lobbying on trade agreements, but is studying the variation in the lobbying expenditures. So within firms, so I'm going to put firm fixed effects and exploiting variation in the spending across trade agreements. And here I can be more forceful in claiming causality because we're going to exploit this exogenous variation in the economic effect, potential effects if the agreement enters into force, and in the expected political support. So let me show you first this is basically lobbying expenditure by firms on particular trade agreements. So this is the dependent variable is lobbying by firm F on agreement A and firm T. We have firm fixed effects, here fixed effects, and the key variables of interest are, of course, these three channels: improved access to foreign consumer, improved access to foreign suppliers, and increased competition. We have two versions of them depending on which tariff you use. So again, these are relying on pre-agreement MFN tariffs and differences in GDP and market size of the trade environment to come up with this measure. And what you see is what you would expect. The firm spends more, this large lobbying firm spend more on this agreement, the more they have to gain in terms of access to foreign consumer, the bigger is the reduction in tariff and the larger is the size of the FTA partner. The more they have to gain in terms of access to inputs, foreign suppliers. This is more relying on the extent of the reduction in US tariffs on their inputs. And then, increased competition reduces your lobby. So there's still something bad. You see, there is, if you could shut down, which you cannot do in FTA because you're supposed to do everything across the board, you don't like the increase in competition that comes with the FTA, but you do like other things that come from the FTA. And this is robust to using also, you could argue this is measurement error. When you look at these expenditures, you do it with the number of reports and you get the same picture. So if you use a different measure of the intensive margin, again, you see that the lobbying expenditures increase with expected gain, and of course, decrease if you in fact, if you expect to have more competition from the FTA final good producers in the same industry. Yes.
But of course, the actual lobbying decision is more complicated than this because you also don't want to spend a lot of lobbying on a bill that's going to pass anyway. So you want the marginal effects.
That's why indeed. Okay. So if you're going, since what is passing, say, okay, since everyone is in favor, I know everyone, we are all the large guys who gain. Why should I even put any effort? So the reason why you would put any effort, if you think politicians, for example, electoral reasons or otherwise, they are more likely to be against. So then you're basically competing. Your contest is not with the opposition, other firms, but is actually with the preferences of politicians, which is going to be our model actually. So what you see is that firms, again, with firm fixed effects and here fixed effects, so we are exploiting again within firm variation across agreements, depending on the political conditions at the time of ratification. And you see that when firms expect more opposition because the government is divided, there's no alignment between the executive and the legislative body, or when there's more Democrats in Congress, which we saw are 40% less likely to vote in favor, then they put more effort because they basically need to pass these things through. And again, that's robust. Okay, so I haven't keep track, so how much? Okay, right. So yes, now this is a good time to.
Is that like an effect on likelihood of starting new negotiation of this agreement?
We haven't looked at that.
Money, I know it's
for example,
anyway,
TPP.
look, I like
no, TPP was one of the examples. There were a massive amount of money, and then Trump gets elected. And my student, former student Michael, has done now is looked at stock market prices of firms that lobby for TPP, spend a lot of money to get these things done, and then it doesn't reach the floor. It gets crap because Trump gets elected, and he looks at the stock market price around election day to inauguration. It just falls massively. So you can do things, but new negotiation we haven't looked at. Yes.
Other variations in what kind of companies are hired to lobby? Like why firms have internal departments lobby? Why don't they just put money together? Like what's the most efficient way? Why
Again,
is-
that's not the question we are addressing. I think 30% of our observation are indirect lobbying, and the other ones are direct lobbying. I think this may vary by issue because other people have studied different issues. Lobbying on migration, they found more indirect lobbying. In our case, I mean, it seems to be more. These are large companies, and they're using mostly their in-house lawyers. I mean, it would be interesting. We are not looking at that, but I think it could be. I mean, there is lots of data one could use, and if you think about the revolving door lobbies, you should definitely look at it. For the Bombardini had these 2 AER papers back to back. They use this similar data. You can see how sometimes you want to use a particular independent lobbyist because he is a former staffer of these congressmen who is in that committee who is dealing with this particular regulation. So sometimes you really want to, I mean, maybe in a particular lobbyist with you hire externally. Sometimes you hire these lobbyists. They go and work for the company. What you want, what these lobbyists give you is information and access. This is what the literature shows. So sometimes because of this revolving door, they have contact with politicians. So you hire them because of their contacts, and you hire them because of their expertise. They may be staffers of particular committees, say dealing with environmental legislation or that point, you're trying to affect the legislation. But so there are papers, if you're interested, I can point to you, that are looking at what are the characteristics of the lobbies, and the data is there to see if they are in-house. We are not using it here. We are sort of, and most of the lobbying is going on in-house.
Just suggesting that since kind of decentralized, there is some competition for like which company hires which lobbyist. But at the same time, you're kind of going through the same role, right? Like if 99% of the firms are pro-agreement. I just wondered if there might be some endogeneity concern.
Let's talk about it maybe later. I'm not sure I get the endogeneity concern. I think there's definitely going to be some competition maybe for lobbyists, but let's talk about it later. Yeah, one and yes.
What's the size of the expenditure on lobbying with those big firms relative to whatever the revenues or something? I mean, is it significant? Because the numbers you showed us, they look like one ad on Super Bowl, and that's it.
I think on average, firms file multiple reports on trade agreement. If you look at the descriptive statistics, so 2.5 reports per trade agreement, and spend something that is not very large. I think it's on average 300,000. But what our model will do is explain partly why this amount is low because of free riding. So if you could internalize, we have an appendix where we say if you could coordinate among all the winners and lobby together, you would actually spend more. But since you're lobbying individually, you're actually, there's free riding, and this would make you spend less than you would if you were actually
So let
internalizing.
me give a conjecture. Perhaps all this lobbying after the bill has been signed by the president. I mean, the bill has been.
Yeah, it's been set.
Yeah,
It's
no,
set in
it's been
stone,
said.
yeah.
It's just maintenance of the connection. And everything happens before when it really matters and when interests are very strong. Because now it seems like they're spending not a lot of money
Well, but
for
it's
things
still,
that are clear. they're
still
going
you
to
see that it matters whether you're sure. If you're sure that it will go through, why would you spend at all? You're spending more when you're more concerned that this thing will not go through. That's why we don't want to use the outcome of the vote, how close it was. Some votes were very close, some votes were not, because this is the result of the lobby. That's truly endogenous. Okay, so briefly, I think I'm gonna probably just stop. No, I maybe we'll just finish this. Maybe no, I'll finish this and then we go to the rest of the topic. I wanted to start the second paper and then be able to do the three, but I'm probably giving up. So the existing literature cannot explain the stylized facts I explained to you, both those on the extensive margin and the intensive margin, because if you look at the workhorse model, Grossman-Helpman protection for sale, not only is it focused on a different policy, but which is unilateral, but even if you look at the FDA paper, the 95, politics of free trade agreements, there are no firms, definitely not heterogeneous, it's sectors, and actually lobbying is exogenous. They take it as given which sectors are organized and not. Here, one of the key things we want to explain is selection, which ones show up as being actually participating in the game. So we need a model that has endogenous lobbying and has heterogeneous firms, which is what our model is doing. And we have different versions and many appendices. Now we are going for this down version, where we have in the economic structure is going to be one with heterogeneity, productivity heterogeneity, a la Mellitz, but more general, you can have, selection into the different margins of trade. It can be export, import, FDI. And then what you can show in this model is that there are distributional effects when a free trade agreement is entered into force. There are winners and losers. But what you can show, and that's key, the key ingredient that you have, and you have it for sure if you have a monopolistically competitive Mellitz model, and we show even with oligopolistic models under some condition you have it, is that the biggest winners that have the biggest stake from the agreement gain more in absolute terms than the biggest losers lose. So if you compare the biggest winners and the biggest losses, there is this asymmetry that the winners gain much more than what the biggest losers lose. So there is an asymmetry in the stakes that comes out from this economic structure. So there are losers, because you're saying, why aren't the losers organized? Why don't I see opposition? And our model can rationalize this asymmetry. So what you need is firm heterogeneity. It works in a monopolistic competition, but even with oligopoly or mixed market structure. And what you need also is a model, and we have this, very tractable contest model in which you have, in principle, firms that are in favor and against, they can lobby. The question is whether they will. So we're going to look at which firms selecting to lobby in these pro and anti-FTA firms. And you also have the politicians themselves may be biased in favor or against. Maybe because they think they're in favor because they think this agreement is welfare enhancing, or maybe they're against because of electoral incentive. But there is a bias, and there's uncertainty about this bias of politicians' preferences over the agreement. These are the key ingredients of our model. I'll give you 3 equations, and then I'll show you how our results rationalize their empirical findings. So this is a free trade agreement with a home and foreign country, star denotes foreign. In each country, you have firm heterogeneity with AF denoting the heterogeneous productivity, your profits domestically in the domestic market are denoted by these. Again, we are saying we have a much more, fully micro-funded Mellitz with CS. We have many versions, but here I'm just going to give you the very basic reduced form model. If you pay a fixed cost, again, you have selection into trade. We call it FI because it's F of internationalization. You can think of it as being, paying a fixed cost to export, to source from foreign suppliers, or to set up my foreign affiliates. It could be any of those. But if you pay this fixed cost to be internationalized, you get additional profits in the foreign market. So overall, your profits as a firm depend on your productivity and whether or not you pay this fixed cost, and you are therefore internationalized. So you have in this model selection into trade, as you have in all these heterogeneous firms model of trade, by the most productive firms. This is nothing new. Yeah.
One question. So what we know from the data again is that those countries are going to gain a lot from the export side, because all of them on that side they are willing to export. The import dimension is much more granular in the sense, much more interesting in the sense that within this group of the firms, some are sourcing their inputs from Korea and others from Thailand for historical reasons or whatever, and this is also going to lead to a bit of variance to exploit in terms of like what trade agreement happy to within the very small set of happy to firms.
Yeah.
What are the agreements that they are going to look more for?
So I showed you the best we can do with the data we have, which is basically CompuStat for the tripartite limited, as you know, is to show you what I showed you before, that the same firm spends more depending on how much it is potentially can gain in terms of exporting, market access gains on the final goods market, and importing. But this is, ideally you would want firm level data and knowing exactly where this firm was sourcing before the agreement, but this data, of course, is how you would get to have access to the census data.
The model is also not going to
No, so
engage
actually
with
in the
the
previous
different
model, we just exporting like that Mellitz. just the export dimension, and that does it. Here we want to be more general because, as you saw, there is no, they gain from there's other dimensions. So we just have this very black box version, but I don't think, I think the main story we are trying to tell is that those that engage in trade, the winners, they can gain from various margins that we saw, and they're going to be the ones selecting into this topic. So what you have in this agreement, again, you can show it, you can see it very easily in Mark's job market paper, or even in the handbook where it's Reading, they have, they point out that in these, when you have these reciprocal trade liberalization, what you have is that the maximum gains are bigger than the maximum losses. So this is really, you have this asymmetry in the stakes from the entry into force of the agreement. That is basically because if you're the biggest loser, you're not very productive anyway. You're much less productive than the biggest winner. So your stakes, what you have to lose, is smaller in absolute terms than the firms is linked to the productivity distribution. So you can always show that the multinational, the superstars have bigger stakes in this entry into force of the agreement, and the biggest loser will lose, but in relative terms, they lose less because they're less profitable to start with, less smaller, they have less stake. The worst they can lose is all their, they're not exporting abroad, they're going to lose all their profits, status quo profit pre-agreement. But that's bounded, while you have, in principle, with Pareto, unbounded gains on the other side. So there is this asymmetry. That's a key ingredient that is going to be needed to explain why that pie chart was all blue. So what you need to then do is, okay, now given these distributional effects, they're winners and losers, but the gains and losses are asymmetric. What are going, let's look at this selection into lobby. So we are going to have that each firm F decide its lobbying expenditure LF, which can be zero if you do not, if you decide not to lobby at all, and in favor of against a proposed FTA. So the agreement has been proposed, has been signed, you can only lobby in favor of against. It's not lobbying about content or anything, it's lobbying in favor of against ratification. And with a note with omega P, the set of pro FTA firms, so those that are gaining, the delta pi is positive, delta pi F is positive, who gain from this FTA, and omega A, the set of anti-FTA firms, who are losing from the FTA. And obviously, if you are domestic firms, for example, one who's not exporting or importing, you're going to be for sure losing because you don't gain access, you don't improve market access abroad, even in terms of final goods or input. So you're going to be a loser. Okay, so there's going to be winners and losers, and these are going to be in these two camps, omega A and omega B. On top of it, we have the politicians. They are deciding on this ratification can be biased in favor of against the agreement. They have their own bias, and that's again, so they can be biased in favor, or they can be biased against. And what's key is that there is uncertainty. So this B, the bias, is a random variable. What matters is that it's not deterministic. It could be that you expect that they are in favor, but you're not 100% sure. There's a possibility that they are against. And that's actually what's needed to guarantee that you have an equilibrium. So what you can then say, okay, what is the overall effort? This is just a bit of notation. So these, what are you, right? It is LP, let's say it's the overall effort of firms in favor, pro and anti, and the probability in this Tallow context success function kind of model, very tractable, is that you have the probability that home ratifies its FTA depends on the spending, overall spending by firms in favor of against, and on the bias. The outcome is probabilistic, and this reflects some randomness in the effectiveness of lobbying and also in the uncertainty of the politician's bias. What you have in order for the agreement to enter into force is not just home that needs to ratify, but foreign needs to ratify too. So the overall expected probability that the agreement is ratified depends on the, is the product of the ratification at home and the ratification abroad. And here we assume, and we have a discussion of what will happen if you can also lobby abroad, that if you lobby only at home, basically you can only affect part of this expected probability. There is the probability that your own country ratifies. What you can then look at is what are the benefits and cost of lobbying. So your benefit of lobbying is going to be by how much you increase the expected probability of ratification in your own country, you cannot affect the ratification in foreign times your change in your profits if the agreement is entered into force minus the cost of lobbying. And this can be true for pro and anti-FTA firms. We can then characterize, we have three lemmas, I'm not going to go into that, but we can characterize the equilibrium set of lobbying firms and in which firms select into this omega L, which is the set of firms that lobby on the trade agreement. And we basically, to explain the key finding, the pie chart in blue, the fact that only winners select into lobbying, we show that there can be two conditions that can be sufficient, they're not even necessary, they can give you result one, which rationalizes our main extensive margin result. Either you assume that the marginal return to lobbying is too low for the biggest loser. So this is the biggest loser, you can show that this is the threshold such that even the biggest losers will not have incentive to lobby. Or you can put a fixed cost of lobbying, then you'll have multiple equilibria. You can fix it with Gobert Itzoki, but we prefer this and that because of multiple equilibria. But you can also alternatively, if you prefer the story, it's equivalent, say there's a fixed cost of lobbying that is large enough that the biggest loser doesn't have incentive to incur it. And then if one of these two conditions holds, you will have a unique equilibrium in which only the largest internationalized pro-FTA firms select into lobby. So this is going to be a subset of the pro-FTA firms, and which is going to contain the most productive pro-FTA firms, the most productive firms in omega. And there's going to be free riding. Somebody was asking about free riding because there's going to be firms, like you can be a winner, but you say, I'm going to rely on Nike, Apple, put in the effort, I'm going to be free riding. And we have, one of the appendices showing if there was no free riding, there would be more spending. But what this model can do, I'll take more at the end, because then I was even planning on presenting two. Now I want at least to finish this one. So what you have is that this model then explains this fact one, but also it is also consistent with the fact two, the fact three, which remember, it was the largest firm and the ones internationalized, they were lobbying. And fact one was their own in favor. And finally, it is consistent with the two results on the intensive margin of lobbying, because in our model, the more you have to gain, the bigger is delta pi, the more you spend. And if you expect that the bias is more likely to be positive, we do this comparative study with B, and the more likely it is that politicians are in favor, the more you put effort trying to push this agreement through. And basically what is happening is that firms are really playing the game. If the other party is not organized, is not lobbying against, what you're really playing the contest with is the government. If the government was for sure in favor, you wouldn't spend any money. If you are not sure they're in favor, you spend money, and the more so, the more you think they may be against. And if they're very much in favor, you're basically free riding on their preference. You say, politicians anyway, they're in favor, why should I push? So this is just a summary in your old smart. I think it is very much echoing and providing support for Danny Roddick's view that the politics of free trade agreements, not politics of trade policy in general, but of free trade agreements dominated by the large winners from these agreements. And it's also echoing some of the other results, like this Vista paper that is looking at MFN tariff suspension, and large companies want reduction in tariffs on their inputs, and they ask Congress to particularly. So there is definitely evidence beyond our paper on other policy that shows that large firms that are internationalized want to reduce protection when this is benefiting them. This is the project I'm now working on, which looks at the content. So there, I think, is fascinating because you can really see, like this is actually Glaxo, for example, that spends 2 million on, and you can really see that it's not just mentioning TPP, it's mentioning TPP intellectual property provisions. And what we can see is that really, if you look at TPP, for example, we have mapped all the TPP agreement with the different, array, we actually looked at all the chapters. And if you look at, since TPP was, the US got out of TPP because of Trump. So now there is a TPP without the US. And you can look at the change in the text. free with the US and without, and all the things that the other parties have taken out are all the things that the US firms lobby for, particular IPR provision, patent protection. So it's really interesting. And more generally, what we are studying, we are looking at the content of trade agreement, the depth of trade agreement in terms of environmental regulation, labor regulation, IPR, investment provision. And what you really see there is that, again, the largest companies, the multinational, and they are putting in this bill their preferred provision. They're really tailoring these agreements. So what we have done today was the tariffs, the traditional trade agreements, a la Grossman-Hellman, but trade and these trade agreements have to eliminate tariffs. And you saw what firms do, but firms do much more. Now some of the lobbying during the negotiation is about these other things you can add in. And there's a lot of spending, and so we're going to have different model, and also a model is going to warn against what a lot of people are starting to do, because there are new data set from the World Bank and other institutions that measure depth of trade agreement. And a lot of people are running regression now saying, the deeper the trade agreement, the more the effects on trade. Like Swati Jingra, many good people are doing that. But what our project shows is that the same large firms that are driving the trade flow, that are accounting for 90% of trade flows, are the ones who actually shaping this depth of trade agreement. So you really cannot interpret these things coldly. Okay, so I had some questions, and I'm gonna have to choose what to do in the after lunch. But okay, let's not even try to start anything new now. So Isabel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, no, but
Yes. Yes.
So I wanted to come back to back for that five that more spending on theirs by government. And in reality, I would have thought it would be more complicated than that, because of course, if you're sure that the vote is going to pass, you're not going to spend very much. But by the same token, if you're pretty sure it's not going to pass, then you're also not going to spend much. The private government may be somewhat too crude.
Okay, so we have done two versions of that, and also two versions of that democratic. So let's go back to that 1 second. So you could have divided, in the stricter sense, both houses, the House and the Senate, are controlled by different majorities. So that's version 1, I think. That's and then the other version, I forgot actually 1 or 2, is at least one of the two chambers is from a different party. And here also, when we do the share, this is continuous, so maybe it's getting more. We can look at non-linearities, which I guess is what you're getting at. But here we count, number 1 is whether you're counting independents or like those who caucus, where like you can deal, you can construct the shares counting the independents or not. We can do more. So what you're suggesting, I guess, is to look at whether it could be non-monotonic, this effect. So if you have, we can look, but we can do it with this continuous measure and not with the divided total, because that's by definition like continuous. Yes.
The context that we have here is not the usual context where the participants decide simultaneously how much to invest. Here it is sequential, because it takes time. And I see that my opponents, or say I'm a losing firm, I see how much the winning firms have invested.
I do see where it's paying, who is paying from what.
Yes, but again, remember that this is the second stage of the game. We already know how much is spent on lobbying and how much you need to get the bill, the formulation of the bill. This is the second stage that we are looking, which is just a ratification. So that's a long-term. So that's a long-term effort. And so I think the crucial thing that you pointed out is exactly that the amount of lobbying of the winning of those that are the winners of the big winning funds is exactly such that it's not worthwhile for the losers to get into the game at all. Right? That was and that's in fact, I think that's very important, because that's exactly why they do spend money. They spend money just at that level that it's not worthwhile for the losers to start outspending them so as to change the outcome.
So what you're doing, you're spending, knowing what they expect of political advice or politician, and knowing everything
And
about the
just
other
the-
firms
just-
and the
yeah,
fixed costs.
And to make the losers, not to make it for the losers, not worthwhile to get into the game. And again, it's not a one shot. It goes quarter by quarter because those 6 take
No,
years.
this is. This
Your
is not
your
good,
data is quarter by quarter, but I can see, for example, in one quarter I
They-
spend a
they
little,
report
and I see that, no, they spend already too much, I have no chance, I stop spending the next quarter. So that's why you see, as you say, the blue
What you
chart.
saw, we are aggregating up the expenditure by region. So we have 18 at the yearly level. Most of the amount of money is spent in the 2 years preceding maximum, because as we said earlier, between the time in which the president signed and ratification, it cannot be more than 2 years. So most of the money is in the last year, the last quarters, and we are aggregating it up. So we are not looking at the timing, oh, I see this is so. But I think it would be interesting to see if there is this work chest or like to study more the dynamics. We actually have a.
Because again, it's in intense contest, the insight is very different. In simultaneous contest, the weak players, which will be the losing ones, they are once in a while going to randomize and spend a lot.
Yeah, in some countries we can.
And
have
that's
it. Yeah,
what,
sure,
that's
sure.
a, that's a,
No, no,
but
here we
that's
don't have
because,
that, yeah.
that's because it's a one decision, once that you do the decision, and that's it. But here it's not, it's many decisions because it's many quarters, and so it's a continuation.
No, in the model is not many
I
decisions
know.
over many quarters. Okay, you are thinking.
I'm talking about the data, I'm talking about
Okay.
what you saw, what you see in practice happening. And I think that that's consistent with what you see in practice.
Okay, but the data, you're not exploiting this dynamic.
Sorry?
I treat it in a simultaneous way. Yeah, I'm not using that dimension. The data, we could.
I'm
but,
talking about the data, not
Okay,
about the model.
yes.
So I was thinking, when you see that lobbying is driven by a few large firms, so I mean, one explanation could be that these large firms have relatively more to gain if it's passed. But wouldn't another explanation also be like, imagine that I'm a small firm and I have a lot to gain if it's passed, but I also know that I don't have the resources to, have any effect in the lobbying process.
Oh, that's exactly
there's
why.
like a threshold
That's-
for when-
Yeah, sure. This is gonna be, and I didn't put all the lemmas, but one of the lemma 3, I think, is exactly characterizing among the omega P. So you're winning, but you're not productive enough to have the incentive, knowing that the others, there's an overall effort by all firms that is gonna affect this probability. You know the others are paying, the largest are gonna pay anyway. You free ride. So I didn't put the lemmas, but you can look at the paper and you'll see. And basically, this is about these results. So you're right. This is, if you look at the 3 lemmas are about characterizing omega L, and one of the results is really that this set of, so you can really see that this set of organized, this is an endogenous set of firms that end up being organized, is only consisting of some firms that are in the omega P camp, but not all of them. It's a subset. So precisely, there are some firms who are not going to be putting the effort, but they're still going to get. And there are, so there's free riding both on the extensive and intensive market in this moment.
Might expect it's an incentive for the firms to organize.
Yes, yes.
Do see
We don't see that, so we have looked for that. We have looked if they use the same lobbies. We don't see any evidence of the data. I had a long discussion with Gianmarco Ottaviano when I presented Conconi, because he was saying, yeah, it should be. So we have a theoretical appendix showing that if they did so, this will be good, beneficial to all. But we don't find any evidence by looking at, do they use the same lobbies? Basically, they play the game as individual firms.
Very seems to point to, again, these private firms.
Yes, that's why I said that it's very different, but there's definitely a line
What
of.
this also implies is that we should see, like, by chance, some areas whereby you have 2 granular firms and eventually that have
Yes,
different interests.
I'm
that are
totally
linked
with you
from
on
the-
that,
and
but the
I
problem
understand you're
is
not going to
that
see
we
it
have, this is the
together.
only country in the world where you have detailed lobbying data like the one we are using, but it's not easy. I have started now a project
I
with
understand
US
the
Census
data.
data with Kamala and Natalia Ramondo, etc. But that project, I cannot even touch the data and it's super hard. I can work as you do with firm level data from Belgium. I can look at all the detailed things you're saying, oh, is there from the starting point from this? I cannot do it with this program. It's impossible. You can have either very detailed lobbying information, but you wouldn't have the firm level rich trade data for the US unless you are a US census employee or you take forever. So here we went with the simplest, most, but we cannot exploit the richness of them.
In terms of what data you want to so suppose you're looking at the European level right now, no data on lobbying.
I have a master student doing something. There's some data about meetings, you know, it's very descriptive of meeting with parliament. Yeah, some.
From the
Yeah.
Meeting, but even if you have no data, this type of models are telling you that I don't know if you're able to see who are the one you have found in Europe, which are like
Sure.
German car makers.
No, but this student had found again similar selection.
Say something about what type of lobbying that you're pushing for,
Yeah.
and then you can.
Yeah, but you cannot see, for example, what issues they lobby on, how much money, but you see in terms of which are the ones that end up on this list of the commission and the parliament, is the Apple, is the same granular fund. So you can at least describe who is lobbying even in Europe, in Brussels, and you'll see there's more industry lobbying in Europe, but there's still, I think in terms of these meetings and where the key players are still the large multinational. A lot of the foreign multinational try to affect Digicom's decision on mergers or data. So I think it would be super interesting to do more with the European data, but we are not there in terms of detailed information.
Without any information and only information about who are the prime outcomes and what are the outcomes like trade agreements, you can do a bit of that. In between, you know that these are the firms that are going to lobby.
But if you don't know that they are lobbying on trade agreement, they could be lobbying on antitrust. How do I know?
No, exactly. Yeah. But
Are you trying to
based
infer?
on their trade activity and the fact that they are the ones that are going to matter, then you can say something.
But also,
about
Isabel, sorry to play that, I will love, but you know, then I will need to, you know, either we play with all the researchers, you have access to the French data, I have access to the Belgium, or my other co-authors access to, so, but you know, you need to look at European firms then. And then there is no such a thing as an administrator, because these are all firms that are facing the same FDA. You would want to have, and if I look at only Belgium, I mean, you could, but anyway, let's continue over lunch. I would say it's time, no? And I will probably just do one paper with the one that is more relevant because it's building. The AR paper is really actually going against Caliendo Paro. So he taught you the NAFTA paper, Lorenzo. So I'm gonna, that RAR came after his Vista, then say, you know, don't believe Lorenzo. No, it's not true. So I'm gonna teach you that, and that model is also that paper is also something that Thierry Meyer and Mark Mellis are now working on for the CAS paper on rules of origin. So I think it's gonna be helpful for his lecture. So I'm just gonna stick to that and forget about anti-dumping. Okay, so I'll leave the sharing thing or stop sharing, I guess. We go. Okay. Cool.
Thank you.